One of the most common misconceptions I hear time and time again from artists is the desire to create these really high quality fine art pieces from imagination. So today I want to bring on an artist that I just feel really honored to get to know, who happens to be an expert in this subject. We're going to be taking a look at a couple of pieces that he made entirely from imagination and diving into the process of how he was able to build up this skill, as well as what the specific process looks like for him to start a painting and take it all the way to a finish when the idea came out of imagination. We'll be diving into how and when to use reference and how and when to use imagination so that by the end of this video, you have a really clear idea of exactly how you need to be integrating this into your own practice. So without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Devin Korwin. Devin, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I'm super excited to be talking with you about this.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So the reason that I wanted to speak with you today is because, like, from the very beginning, your work stood out to me as being this beautiful combination of this like painterly fine art style while also being from imagination. And I know a lot of painters would love to work from imagination, whether they want to like paint their dreams, paint their D&D character, or simply paint things that are just very difficult to get reference for. So I wanted to dive in and ask you a little bit about that process today,
Right.
so that, the people who watch this channel can get a better idea of what is involved in those two workflows. So from your perspective, what would you say, how would you describe the difference between how to work from reference versus how to work from imagination? Like, what would you say is the difference in workflow?
So I would say in some ways they're not quite so different. I think ideally you would always want to be on some level working from imagination, and in a sense not being limited by what is in the reference. You want to be contributing something to the reference. So regardless of if you have any reference in front of you or not, whether you're making a fantasy illustration or doing fine art from a photo reference, you don't ever want to be copying information one-to-one. At the very least, you always want to be reconstructing relationships. I think when you're working from imagination, you're very much in the deep end and you have to know everything, basically. You have to reconstruct the form and you construct the light on top of that form. When you have reference, there's more information to kind of prompt you in front of you. But really, it's whether I'm working from life or from a photo or from imagination, I tend to be thinking in a very similar way. And I think the more you can kind of bridge the gap between those, the more control you have as an artist.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the thing that jumped out at me is, yes, ideally we always have that element of imagination and that we're simplifying, we are omitting needless information, we're making the relationships more elegant or simplified in some way. And at the same time, I think something that is often overlooked for people who are interested in working from imagination, but maybe kind of new to that concept, is that working from imagination requires a great deal of reference, whether that's reference that you painted 10 years ago, your knowledge of anatomy, your knowledge of materials, and like how light is going to interact with them. Would you say that there's kind of like an equal balance of those two things, that like even if you think that you're always working from reference, there's this element of imagination?
Yeah.
Like whenever you're working from imagination,
That's
you
why
always
I think
have that reference.
they're not so separate. And if you are kind of on the extremes, then I think it can be very limiting. The old masters used maquettes. They worked out of clay to make models to look at, but they had done sketches from imagination before. So they kind of knew where they were going and then used the reference as a guide to get where they knew that they wanted to go. I think that's a very effective way to work.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to talk a little bit about like what those specific workflows might look like specifically. But before we jump into that, I want to dive into this idea of working optically versus working constructively, and working from reference versus from imagination, and like when you are most likely to be more reliant on one of those versus the other.
Right. So when you're working purely optically, you really need something in front of you. You can't work from imagination optically. When I first started learning how to draw, I was more in kind of the entertainment art circles, fantasy art, sci-fi, and it was, or animation, and it was always kind of assumed that like drawing meant constructive drawing. And that's just, I never kind of questioned it. And then later on, when I saw more of the kind of atelier method, which was purely optical, I thought that that was kind of, the secrets of the old masters. And I went more in that direction. And I found I was kind of losing ground in the things that I could do before, because I was completely reliant on, having a model in front of me or reference, and I really couldn't contribute much beyond what was already there. And I feel like I've had to kind of undo a lot of that learning and bring back kind of the more intuitive sense for me of like constructive thinking. And really, drawing is sculpting. In order to learn, a lot about drawing, you can just grab a piece of clay, and it doesn't necessarily have to be with pencil and paper. Like the medium doesn't make the drawing.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that distinction. It's something I talk about all the time. I talk about like working on an oil painting, but like finding the drawing. And I think a lot of people assume that I'm referring to pencil and paper when I say drawing. But I love that like you're zooming out even further, and we can talk about the drawing even in something three-dimensional like sculpture.
And it's not just shapes. When you talk about drawing, it's not just having these kind of flat shapes in the right place. It's also the structure and the character of what you're looking at. Also includes the composition. You could talk about kind of an artistic accuracy as opposed to just a pure kind of optical accuracy. These things, all of these elements should build up to kind of a larger whole, a kind of larger idea that you're getting at and communicating with your painting. And I think just kind of only thinking about it as optical shapes is, I think in the long run, a very limiting way to work. And it also takes a very long time to have anything be finished. So you can't really quickly iterate and experiment with a purely optical approach. So I would say if you were only kind of learning one, a constructive thinking is a lot more useful.
Walk me through a little bit exactly what you are imagining when you're talking about working optically versus constructively. Like, what does it mean when we use that language?
Right. So it's not really a method. I think if we were to talk about kind of methods that go into a pure optical approach, really sight size is the big one, where you are optically copying the shapes that are in front of you and not really thinking much about, more of your sense of touch. I think the big kind of differentiation here is your sense of sight versus your sense of touch. Constructive or conceptual thinking is how I usually call it, because it's not even just construction, but that's an aspect of conceptual thinking. Conceptual thinking has to do with when you it's what you know about something. When you close your eyes and imagine it, you can kind of imagine the tactile feel of it, or you can picture kind of form in space. That's conceptual thinking. It has a lot more to do with kind of our ideas about something as opposed to the pure kind of static optical image is projected onto our retina. So the way that we kind of interpret these things in our brain, you can't really separate them entirely. Like the things that you see are also influenced by the things that you know, and what you know also influences what you see. So I think kind of thinking of them as two completely separate approaches, again, doesn't lead to kind of the most control that you can have for your artistic practice.
Yeah. And, when you're kind of walking through those two different approaches or like modalities that we can bring to creating artwork, I think to kind of give people a little sense of like what that shorthand might be. For me, I think of working optically. You had mentioned like the sight size approach. So what you would do when you're like drawing a barg or when you're drawing a cast, you have to stand in the same place. The light needs to be the same. And you're really trying to flatten out all of the 3D information into something 2D. Yeah. I associate that very specifically with how most fine artists work. Even if we have this element of constructive thinking, most of the time we are very reliant upon reference to get what we want. And then what I imagine is the case is that the flip side is true when you're working in like fantasy illustration or you're working in the entertainment industry. You're conceptualizing things that haven't existed in the real world before, potentially. Yeah. And you really need to be able to make something that you can't just put in front of you to reference, because you literally are making something new. Is that like a fair generalization?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you took kind of the optical approach far enough and you took the conceptual approach far enough or constructive, you could hypothetically like arrive at the exact same place. It doesn't really say much about kind of the end result, but it's the thinking that goes into it. So it's more about kind of what is going on in your head while you're creating a piece of artwork. And again, I think like old masters like Sargent couldn't have been working purely optically. You know, his sitters would have conversations with him and he would want them to be lively. He didn't want them to sit still. He wanted to kind of capture the character. This was something that he was doing in his head while he was working. So he was really thinking constructively. It was a very kind of flat graphic approach that he had compared to other artists, but it was still basically working from imagination with the reference in front of you. And again, I think that's regardless of kind of the method that you're working, experimenting with how you're thinking about things while doing it, it can lead to a lot of growth.
I imagine kind of bridging that gap between the two. Something that comes to mind is something like the Loomis method, where like you might get this very fine art finish on something that you construct using a mannequin, for instance, or like really simplifying the forms of the body. But you could take it really either direction. You could kind of take it in this completely new, I'm making something for the first time, I'm designing a character, something I can't reference, or you could use it to really supplement a model standing in front of you. Is that fair?
Yeah. So you mean like thinking of the body as simple primitives like cylinders and boxes.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think of these things as generally more broadly as compression. So you're taking information in front of you, whether it's form. If you compress form, you get these kind of simple forms that you can rearrange into hopefully things that look like the body, and you can kind of rotate them around in your head. Portraiture, you can think of like the Asaro head. These are like conceptual compressed breakdowns of form. And I would recommend kind of making your own, like learning from the ones that are out there, like kind of the Loomis planar head and the Asaro head, but also doing your own research, like using skulls and 3D scans are great because you can really kind of rotate the form around and try and like reconstruct that form in as few planes as possible so you can rotate it, light it in your head, and then you have tons of control as an artist. And that same concept of compression can be used optically also. And that's really what you're doing with like shape design is. You take a shape and you basically average it out. You figure out like what is the kind of threshold for the angles here that I could use to create like an envelope, or to use straight lines to kind of describe a curve. So this concept of compression is kind of how we take all of this complicated information in front of us, form, shape, color, and get it into groups, basically, kind of usable things that we can use to design with. And I think that's really the most important thing here. Like these are all tools in order to design, to communicate something. And I think really if you're relying on kind of only one of these and not exploring the big picture of how everything works together, then it's just fewer tools that you can use to communicate with others with your art.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense, because if I asked myself to sit down and completely simulate a portrait from imagination, and I have to think about the flesh tones, I have to think about the lighting, I have to think about like really understanding the interaction between the light and the local tone and like how this all of these interactions take place, not to mention the complexity of the anatomy of somebody's face and capturing a likeness. That is, I could probably create something that looked like a person, but it wouldn't really compare to some of the portraits I've done in the past. But if you asked me to conceptualize a sphere and light it, suddenly that becomes a lot simpler. So, and that sounds like it's the real idea that you're getting to, that you can, when you talk about compression, it's that.
And there's something in between, kind of like a full anatomical portrait and a sphere, where you can still do that in your head and you still can rotate that around, kind of simulate the lighting in your head. And then, you can kind of build your own kind of mental models of things.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, how long did it take you to get to the point where you could run that simulation in your head?
It was something I always tried to do from the beginning. I think that's what's kind of unique about getting more into being more inspired by kind of video game art and the entertainment industry, is that it's kind of always expected. And what I've learned is that that's again more kind of what the old masters were doing. They were working out of their heads. They would do sketches before a painting. They were pretty much purely from imagination, and then hire models. When you think about kind of optical copying, it's a very useful skill, and like knowing how to see. And I think of it as almost like for two things. Number one is if you're working from reference as a way to get an accurate scaffolding and like keep your construction in check, because yeah, I can't memorize like a perfect characteristic portrait of somebody and rotate around in my head. So reference is very important. And I'll use those kinds of optical measuring skills to make sure that my constructive thinking is not having any kind of major distortions. The other way that I'll kind of use that learning to see skill is I talked about artistic accuracy and like the composition is thinking about how all of the relationships are working together and seeing if anything is kind of not contributing to that larger whole. If you can only construct and you can't see, often like compositions, there's not a lot of like poetry to the brushstrokes or anything like that. Like I think that pure kind of optical seeing is really important for the abstract side of thinking.
I'm curious, what do you think is like the stereotypical look that you get from working primarily optically versus primarily constructively?
So I think optically, I always try and compare and contrast things in art. So I think the stereotypical look is that something purely optical has this like sense of being a jigsaw puzzle where it's just kind of shapes that are very flat. It could be good for showing kind of like flattening out shapes can show atmosphere. I think it's very good for showing atmosphere and like losing information. You get away from your sense of touch and becomes more of like purely kind of the pattern that you see from your eyes. If you work very constructively, you can lose out on a lot of that kind of light effect if you're not looking for it. But you gain a lot of this tactile feeling of solidity and form, which can be very satisfying. And a lot of the work that I like has that form and that very solid drawing. But there's also atmosphere and a consideration of shape and how that all adds up together to create an interesting composition at its whole, a design, basically.
Yeah. I feel like I can usually tell when something has been made constructively or conceptually because it isn't as loose and painterly. Based on what you're saying, it sounds like the reason that might happen is that when you're looking at something optically, you can figure out how you can simplify some of those jigsaw puzzle pieces, but like that just isn't quite as intuitive when you're working conceptually. Do you think?
And I'll switch back and forth very quickly. Like I've practiced like, okay, at this point in the picture, I need to really focus on kind of very concrete drawing, and I'll go into kind of construction mode. And then, okay, do these shapes, and does what I created kind of work with the larger whole? I'll switch back to kind of like, I'm looking at a flat surface and I'm in control here, basically. These are not objects, these are just abstract designs. And then I will think a lot more optically and a lot more compositionally and abstractly. So I think it's really, again, like not thinking of them as these two separate camps. And I think art education has made them into these two separate camps, but really they're just two sides of the same coin. And if you learn both of them and think of them as the same thing, as just aspects of drawing, it can allow you to do anything.
So I'm super curious based on that, if you were teaching somebody who had really only learned the constructive or conceptual approach, or vice versa, and they really only ever learned to work from reference, when would you recommend that they switch gears and like start building that other approach? Is there a certain amount of foundational skills that you want to have before you start like adding in this complexity and possibly muddying the waters? Or even is it necessary to really have a full understanding of both for every artist?
So it depends on your goals. I think it's really good to learn the principles instead of specific processes, because if you decide you want to do something differently, then you can do it. You wake up the next morning, you want to do imaginative work, then you have the tools to do it. If you only learn how to copy site size optically, you can only ever do that thing. And if you have a kind of a new idea in the future, you have to figure out how to make that process work for something it's probably not really intended to facilitate. So I try to give my students like as many tools as possible, non-specific principles that they can use to do whatever they want. And if they're very passionate about something now, they can apply it to that. And if something comes up later, it's really the same principles. It doesn't really matter what style it is. So if I see that a student is a lot more proficient in construction, is not really thinking optically or abstractly or in kind of a flat way, I'll totally focus on that, because I think that imbalance can be, again, kind of limiting. And the opposite is also true. If a student is really only used to kind of looking at shapes and copying those shapes, then all we will focus on is thinking about things as form, and you can't use light anymore. You can't use light and shadow patterns. And, you know, these things can be something you can really kind of latch onto, and it can be scary if all you know is light and shadow patterns, so you can't use that tool anymore. But I think that kind of like, it can be scary, but diving into that deep end of the unknown can really lead to a lot of growth.
Yeah, I know when you and I first met and started like diving into this in a big way, I was definitely one of those people where I had been working predominantly optically for all of my painting years, and having to go back to not ground zero because I knew more than I thought, but at the same time, it really felt like going back to square one was really rough. So like rough on the ego, it's super tempting to like switch back to what you know you do well. So it sounds like based on that, really understanding when you are in this optical mode versus this conceptual mode is really helpful, because we do them more, we utilize them more than we think, but not just like having that understanding from the very beginning, but also really cultivating both sides of yourself from the very beginning. That sounds like really what you're driving at, that like having that understanding of both pieces at a foundational level versus just diving into one for a really long time before diving into another. Sounds like that's what you're advocating for, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm curious what you think about it.
I try to de-emphasize like results, because like you were saying, it can be really scary to like let go of something that you know that you're good at, because your whole kind of identity as an artist is tied to making, you know, complete finished work that other people can respond to. And I think if that's, you know, that's why it's important, like as early as possible, so that kind of resistance isn't built up too strongly yet. But there's always, it's never going to be perfect. Like I definitely have imbalances, and I feel more comfortable teaching the more abstract, even optical side to students, and applying those same principles of compression and simplifying form, I find is more difficult for me. So whenever I have a student that really needs that, it's like, okay, this is also for me. I'm doing the homework at the same time as them. So yeah.
What are some of the things that you would recommend to artists who are in each of these two camps? So if somebody came to you and they were really comfortable compressing those forms and thinking constructively, but they like really need that help with the optical side, what would be like some of your go-to exercises you would help them dive into, and then vice versa for the other side?
Yeah, so if you need to study optical thinking, and I think the only time to really separate these is, again, kind of when you're studying. When it comes to making a painting, it's all about the idea. Well, what does the idea need? Does it need optical thinking? Does it need constructive or conceptual thinking? So never having kind of like a preset process, but always deciding on that based on, you know, again, what the idea is calling for. So when I'm giving homework assignments that really kind of target these two things, for the optical side, painting in two values, and I think you just had a video on this, with really distinct differences between those two groups, where you have to say, okay, this information is either in one group or the other group, is the best possible way to practice this. And you can do that from photos, you can do that from life, you could do that from imagination, you could do master studies. And with just a little bit of practice thinking this way, you start to see the world in this two-value compressed form, and you're used to making those decisions about, you know, sorting things into these two groups. If you can do that, you can put them in 3 groups and 4 groups. And with 4 groups, you can show basically anything. And I find learning that optical approach, once you're thinking in that new way, it happens really quickly. Like a few weeks of this practice, and you'll find like, you know, so much improvement. I find constructively, the best thing is really, it's the same principle. You're doing the same thing. You're compressing things into groups and averaging out information. You could work from same idea. You could work from photos, from master studies. You could work from life and from imagination. I think a combination of all of these things is the best. You can simplify what you see into primitive forms. And the idea is to get the forms as simple as possible. So say like boxes, spheres, cones, but have those forms be as representative of the thing that you're looking at or that you want to depict as possible. So there's a balance there between how simple is it and how representative is it of that object. And if you can construct form and you can compress light and you can construct the way the light falls on the form, really like this, it stops becoming so overwhelming and starts to feel very possible to do anything for imagination. And then when you look at reference, all you see in the reference is potential relationships, and you can use those relationships to design with. And that's when you really have control, because the reference is not making the decisions, you're making the decisions.
That's such a great answer. And yes, I was thinking of you the entire time I made that YouTube video. And I was like compulsively looking back through the notes I took from you about this and trying to do this concept justice, because this was really something you handed down to me. And I think before you and I worked together, I really thought like a 3-value study was just as valuable as a 2-value study or a 5-value study or whatever the case may be. And I'm really curious to hear how you would describe why going back to that 2-value design over a 3-value design, like really forces you to get to that like next level of thinking.
Right. So with just 2 values, you're finding like the biggest possible, the simplest statement of the thing that you're trying to say. So it also makes it easier to manipulate the groups that you have. The more groups that you have, like the harder it is to actually make changes. If you only have 2 groups, everything is forced to relate to each other. It's either light or it's dark. You don't get things that kind of look pasted in, because it's all part of those same 2 groups. So if you can get an image working that simply, that's basically your foundation of it. Then you can add, if this is a house, that's your foundation. You can add everything on top of that. And it's going to sit on this very stable foundation. So it's the same with, constructing the form and color. If you have these like simple groups, and that's powerful on its own, then the next decisions become so much easier.
I'm really curious how this applies to the work that I have up for this video. These paintings that you've been working on recently, how do you utilize this idea of like this very decisive and simplified foundation to build out something really complex and nuanced from imagination?
So basically, I can't do everything at once. I need to kind of break this down into something. If I am only thinking in 2 values, like it frees up so much brain power to think about the idea and the composition and the drawing. Having things be in the right perspective. Really, the most important parts of a picture I want to get down first. I can solve a lot of the big problems, and the things are simple enough for it not to be overwhelming. So I'll really usually start there. Again, there's not any kind of correct process, but for me, usually that makes a lot of sense. Other times it might make a lot of sense to just start with very complicated details, and maybe I'll find like an interesting idea that way. But yeah, for reliability, I found that this process is, it's very helpful.
Yeah. Do you often start first with your idea of like what you want to capture, or do you often start from like that abstract 2-value design, or is it a real blend of both?
Yeah. So if I have an idea already, then I usually do start in a simple 2 or 3 value thing. If the color is really important to it, then I'll start with color. If the color is not so important, then I'll start with value. If the drawing is the most important thing, then I might start with line. Really, whatever tool is best for the idea is where I will start.
Awesome. And is that what you did for these particular pieces?
Yeah. So I started in 2 values. And if I don't have an idea already, then I find it's also a good way to explore, though it can be kind of limiting because you tend to get the same results if you use the same process over again. I think if I don't have an idea already, then I won't put any emphasis on having like a finished product at the end of it. I'll think of it purely just exploratory. And then once I find my idea through whatever process, then I'll try to go back to the kind of reliable way that I know how to like take an idea and then, get that over the finish line.
Well, speaking of exploration, I know you recently dove into oil painting in a big way. Tell me a little bit about like what made you want to make that switch. And I'm curious if the same workflow that we've been talking about applies if you're working in oil, or what you think your workflow might be if you wanted to create a finished piece in oil, taking into account the skills that you're bringing to the table when you work digitally.
The process of being in charge of the idea first and not having any kind of reference to influence it, but really you are, in service of the idea and you're exploring. You can do that in a sketchbook or digitally or a small oil sketch. And I think having that first is really, really important. Then when you need the kind of extra resolution of details, that's when you can bring in reference. You can either hire models or, however it may be, whatever the process is. But that is exactly the same thing that I do digitally that I would do, hopefully, to have some finished oil pieces. And again, that's really inspired from how the old masters used to work, where they didn't usually start with a model. They did studies in service of kind of the idea that they already had. In terms of two-value thinking being useful for oil painting, I think that's basically what an underpainting usually is. If you have like, I think thinking of that as one group or the other gets you a really useful base to then work on top of. So some of the techniques that you can use digitally don't directly translate in terms of like the specific process that you use, but I think the ideas are exactly the same.
Yeah. And it sounds like that overall process would be, come up with a sketch from imagination to capture the basic ideas of the composition and solve some of those compositional problems. And you might do that, traditionally with a quick oil sketch, or you might do that digitally.
Yeah.
I know digital has a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to work and rework and do that without muddying up the painting. And then from there, if you needed that extra reference, that's when you would bring the model in and you would sit down with the actual canvas you wanted to work on.
And I think it's great to kind of hold off as long as you possibly can on the reference, because at that point where you start to get a little bit uncomfortable is where like a lot of the learning happens.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that. I think I personally need to hear that. It sounds like too, there's an element of by the time you want to really get into the finished piece on canvas, you really want to have every possible question answered, except for the very specific things that reference is getting you. Because I know, one thing I talk about on the channel all the time is that you like really don't want to be putting brush to canvas by the seat of your pants and realizing you had no plan for the background and you were hoping it would just come to you.
Exactly. Painting is problem solving. And if you're just kind of leaving problems until later, hoping that they'll be solved magically, like it never happens. So what I think is the most logical way to approach things is you solve the biggest problems first, and then you get to the smaller and smaller ones. Then you find that a finished painting is almost an emergent property of solving these problems. And it really takes a lot of the stress out of it if you don't kind of avoid the big stuff. And if you only work, say, in two values or these big volumes conceptually, it really forces you to focus on the big relationships.
Awesome. Well, we have gone through so much, and I feel like that's such a nice note to wrap up on. But before we do, just to kind of tie this all together, for people who aren't sure whether they need to be studying optically or whether like they need to primarily be working from reference in their work, or maybe they want to work from imagination and they just aren't quite sure which approach is going to be appropriate for them, what advice would you have for people to help better like understand that? Or just simply what advice would you give people to be able to set themselves up for the most success?
I would say read a variety of sources, look at a variety of sources, and never take anything as a rule. Kind of question everything that you learn. If somebody tells you that like a process is the way to draw, it's probably not true. And I think ideally you can look for a teacher that understands the larger context of everything, rather than teaching a tiny part of it as the method and not how everything works together, because that will only get you one result forever. So teachers that help you achieve what you want to achieve, that's what to look for. And yeah, I think it can be difficult knowing that as a beginner, but I think, what you're doing on your channel is a great way to find that, and your mentorships.
Well, I know that I'm not the only one who is teaching and mentoring other artists. I know that you recently started up your own school. Tell me a little bit about that and how people can find out more about it.
Right. So I've been doing private mentorships for about the past 2 years, and I really wanted to start doing more group classes, and bringing other teachers who have similar philosophies on board to teach really the big picture of art. So I started an art school called Underpaint Academy. It's an online art school with live classes. And yeah, you can find out more at underpaintacademy.com. There's an Instagram also. And yeah, I'm trying to put together artists who I would really want to learn from, who have a unique voice, a unique vision, and don't teach any particular kind of specific process that only gets you one result, but can help you achieve what your specific goals are.
That's awesome. I really wish I had known about this when I was just at the beginning of my journey, because I know through private mentorship with you, like just how much you have to offer. And I hope this conversation has been a great taste of all of that knowledge. I'll make sure that I link to that Instagram and to your website in the description. Is there any other way that people can follow you and see what you're up to and keep in touch?
Sure. So I post on Instagram at Devin Korwin. I have a Twitter account also. I post some free tutorials sometimes. Other than that, my website, devinkorwin.com. And yeah, I think that's it.
Perfect. Well, Devin, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. I always feel so like energized and invigorated, and I feel like my brain feels just happy whenever we get to dive into these things. So I'm so excited that I got to share this with everyone who watches this channel. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. It's always a pleasure.
And that is it for my conversation with Devin Korwin. If you have any questions for either me or Devin, please make sure to drop them in the comments. Devin and I have already talked about planning a follow-up video to this one, so I would love to hear what your top questions around working from imagination are. And again, if you want to check out Devin or his school, make sure to check out the links in the description. All right, until next time, happy painting.